Let me also explain forgiveness, because that's a slippery term too. Forgiveness does not necessarily mean warm fuzzies. How does someone who's been abused as a child sexually have warm fuzzies about their abuser? To forgive means that you do not hold this against them. That if you went out and they were ran over by a car, okay, instead of spitting on them and kicking them, you'd call 911 to get them help. Because love is shown in action. Right? When he says love your enemy, he doesn't mean necessarily have warm fuzzies. And he explains it. If your enemy is hungry, that doesn't mean have warm fuzzies, but you feed him. Your enemy is thirsty, you give him some. So we're not talking. So when we talk about forgiveness, don't automatically think warm fuzzies or that you have to accept what was done. What was done probably was wrong. Okay? But that you have the attitude of what's in the best interest. And that doesn't mean you have to be around the person or anything like that. So sometimes the word forgiveness, we misunderstand what forgiveness means and make it even what? More difficult. Yes, Don.
You know, I've been bothered with this one person for years. And it's not that I didn't accept his apology at the time, but he continued to do the same thing and apologize for it.
Yep.
So I just kind of like let it go.
Yep.
And I still try not to associate.
That's okay. Nothing wrong with that. Nothing wrong with that.
Because one of the things I remember is, how many times do we forgive?
Yeah. Well, Jesus said 70 times 7. And he didn't mean carry around your calculator with you. But there are nuances here. For example, doesn't mean you have to hang around with that person. That's not the point. Yeah. So this is tough, but it's right in the Lord's Prayer, isn't it? See why we need God's grace and Spirit? Okay, would you put a 6 out to the left of, and lead us not into temptation? Now this one is often confused too. I realize it looks like, well, God's going to lead us into a temptation, but what we're really praying for is this. Dear Father, when I am tempted, it's like what Paul says in 1 Corinthians, give me a way out. That I either resist this temptation or find a way out. Because we know, for example, in several Bible passages, including in James, James says God tempts no one. Now, God will test us, but never tempt us. Well, what's the difference? The devil will tempt us to do the wrong thing. God will test us to do the right thing. But God will never lead us to sin. And so whenever we're tempted to sin, we're asking God, give me the strength and the power to resist this sin and temptation. For example, as Jesus says, you know the passages, pick up your cross, deny yourself in the midst of a temptation, and follow me. Yeah. So that's what he means there. Now, closely related, put a 7 to the left of deliver us from evil. And do you see here again the words of grace, how dependent we are on God? That's what I want you to see here. How dependent we are. Because if God wasn't helping us, why? What's the implication? We'd be in deep trouble, wouldn't we? Deliver us from evil. Now, the one interesting thing I have to tell you on this one, the Greek phrase here, from evil, is used elsewhere. And there's no reason, as in other places, although I don't have them written down for you, that this could not be translated, deliver us from the evil one. Meaning who? Yeah. Satan or the devil. There's no reason it couldn't be translated that way. I'm not being critical. That's fine. Deliver us from evil, because it's all kind of a package deal, isn't it? But it could be easily translated from the evil one, which the same words are translated that way elsewhere. So we want to be delivered from the power of Satan and the power of evil. Now, for thine is the kingdom. This is the conclusion. Now, let me say a few things on this, because you can read this in any good study Bible. From what we can tell, probably this conclusion was not spoken by Jesus. How do we know that? Well, in the New Testament, we have a lot of manuscripts. We have about 5,000 manuscripts for the New Testament. We have more manuscripts for the New Testament than any other human document in the history of humanity. And so we can compare all these documents. And the earliest documents that are dated don't have this phrase. Well, where did it come from? The best scholarly guess is, based upon putting all these things together, probably for thine is the kingdom, power, and the glory. came from 1 Chronicles 29:11. You can look it up on your own. 1 Chronicles 29:11. And probably came into the text as the Lord's Prayer and the scripture passages were used in worship, in the liturgy. Okay? And you can read this. This is no secret. You can read this in any good Bible. This isn't some secret someplace. Any good Bible will tell you just what I told you. But it says, "For thine is the kingdom, the power, and the glory," based upon 1 Chronicles 29:11, which is biblical. It is biblical. It's just whether it came directly from Jesus or not. It's certainly biblical. And so we're saying basically at the end of the prayer, it's your kingdom. It's your kingdom. That's why we're praying. And you have the power. That's also why we're praying. And who gets all the glory? God does. Yeah, God gets all the glory forever and ever. Amen. Now, with the word amen, it says our prayers heard. That's part of the conclusion. And this is where I get a little bit silly. You know how I get silly every once in a while. Sometimes we Christians are just too weak on our amen, especially us Lutherans. This is where, I get silly, as I told you. This is where we Lutherans could learn some lessons from Baptists and Pentecostals. They know how to say amen. Because the point is, amen comes from a Hebrew word, goes from Hebrew in the Old Testament, that comes from the family of words for faith, belief. And then it goes from the Hebrew of the Old Testament, the same word, into the Greek of the New Testament, and then into the English or whatever language we were talking about. But the Hebrew word from where we back that all up comes from the word for faith. And that's why if you read any study on the word amen, it usually is translated or explains something like the Hebrew word means it is so, or so be it, or it is certain, because it comes from that faith word. So at the end of a prayer, when you say amen, it's not a period. Okay, I'm done talking. That's not what amen means, although that's the way sometimes we say it, myself included, unfortunately. Well, if I were to explain it, well, if it's not a period, what does amen mean at the end of the prayer? Amen. We've brought this to God, right? And amen being part of the Hebrew word for faith and belief and certainty. Amen. Yeah? And so that's the way we say it. Now, for those that do come to our worship service, you might notice in the printed liturgy, and everybody's going to look on Sunday, I'm sure that's going to be there Sunday. I've embellished in the liturgy in our insert that's not in the book. And I've changed all the periods at the ends of the amens to exclamation points to remind everybody that's been through the adult information class that when you see that exclamation point, you're supposed to remember, amen. And I can usually hear those people out there who have been through the adult information class. Now, I don't want you to make a show of it and you'll bring attention to yourself, but you get my point. We're supposed to say the amen as if it means that we've brought this to who? We've brought it to God, who loves us more than anybody, who's the creator of the universe, has the power to help us if it's according to his will. Amen.